The hum of the office ventilation always sounds like a low, exhausted sigh at midnight. Avery leaned back in her ergonomic chair, the cool glow of her dual monitors illuminating the sharp lines of her collarbones. She massaged her temples, her long, slender fingers tracing the edge of her jawline with a weariness that only corporate deadlines could induce. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the New York skyline glittered like a scattered box of diamonds, indifferent to her solitude. A small digital clock in the corner of her screen flickered, the numbers shifting silently to 12 a.m. It was official. October 14th had arrived, and with it, another year of surviving on caffeine, ambition, and empty apartments. Avery reached into her trench coat pocket, pulling out a slightly crushed raspberry macaron she had bought during her 20-minute lunch break. She placed it carefully on a clean napkin in the center of her desk. From her drawer, she produced a single, wooden match, a relic from a restaurant she could rarely afford to visit. The strike of the match was loud in the cavernous, darkened office, a sudden flare of warm gold dancing in her dark eyes. She held the flame over the pastry, pretending for a brief second that it was a grand candle on a towering cake. Her voice, usually commanding and precise in boardrooms, broke the silence as a soft, velvety whisper. "Happy birthday to me," she began, her tone carrying a light, ironic edge to mask the sudden ache in her chest. She watched the flame burn down toward her fingers, the heat growing closer, matching the quiet intensity in her chest. "Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday, dear Avery." The words hung in the air, fragile and beautifully tragic, stripping away the professional armor she wore like a shield every day. "Happy birthday to me." She blew out the flame, a thin wisp of gray smoke curling up toward the ceiling, leaving her in the dim, blue light of her computer screen. A soft, deliberate rustle of silk tore through the quiet before she could even inhale. "You skipped the wish," a voice murmured from the shadows near the doorway. Avery froze, every muscle in her back tightening as a shiver cascaded down her spine. The voice was unmistakable, low, rich, laced with an effortless authority that usually commanded million-dollar mergers. Victoria Vance. The CEO, the woman whose reputation for cold efficiency kept the entire marketing department in a state of perpetual awe. Avery turned her head slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Victoria was leaning against the glass door frame, her heavy wool coat draped elegantly over her arm, her silk blouse slightly unbuttoned at the throat. The fierce, untouchable aura she wore during the day had softened into something dark, magnetic, and dangerously observant. "Miss Vance," Avery breathed, her throat dry, desperately trying to reassemble her shattered composure. "I didn't realize anyone else was still in the building." Victoria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow, measured step into Avery's private office cubicle. The subtle scent of black orchid and expensive leather accompanied her movement, filling the small space instantly. "I could ask you the same thing, Avery," Victoria said, her eyes locked onto Avery's with an intensity that felt almost physical. She walked closer until she was standing just inches behind Avery's chair, looking down at the tiny, smoking macaron. The proximity was intoxicating. Avery could feel the faint warmth radiating from Victoria's body, contrasting with the chilly office air. "It seems my finest creative director is spending her special day making million-dollar adjustments for clients who don't care," Victoria whispered. Her fingers, adorned with a single silver band, brushed lightly against the back of Avery's chair, close enough to touch her shoulder. "That feels like a failure on my part as a leader." Avery swallowed hard, tilting her chin up to meet Victoria's gaze, refusing to let her vulnerability turn into weakness. "It's just a campaign, Miss Vance. And it's just a birthday. It doesn't require a celebration." Victoria lowered herself slightly, her face hovering just inches from Avery's ear, her breath stirring a stray lock of Avery's dark hair. Everything about you requires a celebration, Avery. You simply haven't found anyone worthy enough to throw it for you. The statement was heavy with an unexpressed promise, the atmosphere between them shifting from professional courtesy to something thick and unspoken. Victoria reached past Avery's shoulder, her arm brushing against Avery's sleeve, and picked up the unlit wooden matchbox from the desk. "Make your wish now," Victoria commanded softly, her voice dropping an octave as she opened the box. "I don't believe in wishes," Avery replied, her eyes tracking the elegant movement of Victoria's hands. "Then believe in me," Victoria murmured, striking a new match with a swift, elegant motion. The bright flame illuminated the dangerous, beautiful curve of Victoria's lips as she held it between them, waiting. Avery looked from the flame into Victoria's hooded, dark eyes, seeing a reflection of a hunger that had nothing to do with business. She closed her eyes for a single second, inhaling the scent of the woman standing over her, and blew the flame out between them. In the sudden darkness, Victoria's hand lingered near Avery's cheek, her thumb grazing the very edge of Avery's jawline before pulling away. "Happy birthday, Avery," Victoria whispered into the dark. "Tomorrow, your schedule belongs to me." The morning light filtered through the blinds of Avery's apartment, bringing with it a sharp wave of reality. She sat at the edge of her bed, her fingers tracing her jawline where Victoria's thumb had lingered just hours before. The memory felt like a phantom fever, a dangerous hallucination born from corporate burnout and midnight loneliness. By 8:45 a.m., Avery was passing through the glass turnstiles of Vance Global headquarters, her heels clicking with a forced confidence. She wore a crisp, high-collared white blouse and tailored charcoal trousers, an armor designed to hide her racing pulse. As she settled at her desk, she braced herself for the standard mountain of unread emails and angry client revisions. Instead, when her laptop screen flickered to life, her digital calendar was completely blank. Every single meeting, presentation, and mandatory workshop had been erased from her schedule. In their place was a single, blocked-out crimson bar stretching from 9 to 5. The description read simply, "Reserved for the Chief Executive Officer." Before Avery could process the sight, a soft chime echoed from her private line. "Avery," the voice of Victoria's executive assistant murmured through the speaker. "The elevator is held for you." Avery swallowed the lump in her throat, gathered her leather portfolio, and walked toward the private executive lift. The doors slid open smoothly, swallowing her into a mirrored capsule that ascended directly to the penthouse floor. When the elevator chimed at the top, the layout opened into a vast, sun-drenched sanctuary of white marble and glass. Victoria Vance was standing by the panoramic window, a porcelain cup of black coffee held elegantly between her fingers. She had traded yesterday's heavy coat for a bespoke charcoal pinstripe vest that hugged the narrow curve of her waist. Her blonde hair was swept up into a flawless, intricate twist, exposing the pale, smooth expanse of her neck. She looked entirely untouchable, every inch the ruthless tech billionaire the financial magazines gossiped about. Yet, as Avery stepped out, Victoria turned, and her sharp blue eyes darkened with immediate, intense recognition. "You look tired, Avery," Victoria noted, her voice a low, melodic purr that defied the formal setting. "I didn't sleep well, Miss Vance," Avery replied honestly, keeping her distance by remaining near the marble reception desk. Victoria set her coffee down with a soft click, her gaze tracking Avery's posture with predatory precision. "Good," Victoria said, a faint, enigmatic smile touching the corner of her lips. "I would be insulted if you slept perfectly after last night." Avery felt a sudden spike of heat rush up her neck, her professional boundaries dissolving under that single look. "About last night, Miss Vance, I hope my behavior didn't cross any professional lines." Victoria walked forward, her slow, deliberate steps narrowing the distance until she stood directly in Avery's personal space. "You didn't cross a line, Avery," Victoria whispered, her eyes dropping briefly to Avery's lips before locking back onto her gaze. I did. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the unsaid promises that had started under the flare of a wooden match. Victoria reached out, her fingers catching the edge of Avery's leather portfolio and gently tugging it away from her chest. She dropped the portfolio onto a nearby table without looking, effectively stripping Avery of her workplace shield. Today, we are leaving the building, Victoria announced, turning toward the private coat rack. We have an off-site inspection. Avery blinked, confused by the sudden shift. An inspection? For which client? Victoria slipped into a lightweight cashmere trench coat, adjusting the lapels with an effortless, practiced grace. For me, Victoria murmured, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that made Avery's heart skip a beat. I am inspecting the woman who works herself to the bone on her own birthday. 20 minutes later, they were descending into the private underground parking garage, away from the prying eyes of the staff. A sleek, midnight black town car was waiting, its engine purring softly in the concrete shadows. The private driver held the rear door open, bowing his head respectfully as Victoria gestured for Avery to enter first. Avery slid across the supple, custom-stitched leather seat, the interior smelling faintly of Victoria's signature black orchid perfume. Victoria climbed in beside her, the heavy door closing with a solid, muffled thud that sealed them away from the rest of the world. The space was tight, intimate, and entirely devoid of the corporate hierarchy that usually kept them apart. As the car pulled out into the chaotic Manhattan traffic, the sudden acceleration caused Avery to slide slightly to the left. Her shoulder brushed firmly against Victoria's, the contact sending a sharp electric current through her entire upper body. Avery immediately tried to pull back, adjusting her position to give the CEO more room in the wide backseat. But before she could move, Victoria's hand reached out, her cool fingers wrapping firmly around Avery's wrist. Stay, Victoria commanded softly, her grip gentle but unyielding as she guided Avery back into alignment. She didn't let go of Avery's wrist immediately. Instead, her thumb brushed over the delicate skin where Avery's pulse was visibly thumping. You don't need to hide from me in this car, Avery, Victoria murmured, her voice dropping to a seductive, private register. Out there, I am the CEO. In here, I am just a woman who wants to ensure you are taken care of. Avery looked down at Victoria's hand, watching the contrast of Victoria's pale skin against her own dark sleeve. Why are you doing this, Victoria? Avery asked, using the CEO's first name for the very first time, the word tasting dangerous on her tongue. Victoria's eyes flared with something dark and fiercely satisfied at the sound of her name spoken in that tone. She tilted her head, her lips agonizingly close to Avery's ear as the car sped through the city streets. Because for 3 years, I have watched you build my empire while neglecting your own heart, Victoria whispered. And last night, when I heard you singing to yourself, I realized I could no longer tolerate anyone else having your attention. The town car glided to a halt in front of an unmarked, ivy-draped brownstone in the heart of the Upper East Side. There were no glowing signs or hovering valets, only a heavy oak door that opened before the driver even cut the engine. Avery stepped out onto the cobblestone pavement, immediately noticing the absolute silence of the secluded courtyard. Victoria materialized beside her, a steady and commanding presence that seemed to warp the very air around them. This is my private club, Avery, Victoria said, gesturing for her to step over the brass threshold. No clients, no board members, and absolutely no corporate emails are allowed past these walls. The interior was a masterclass in understated luxury, featuring dark mahogany panels and plush, emerald velvet seating. A very discreet maître d' bowed low, greeting Victoria by name before vanishing into the softly lit corridors. They were led into a secluded dining atrium enveloped by glass walls that looked out onto a hidden, manicured garden. The entire room was empty, specifically reserved for the two of them on a busy Tuesday afternoon. Avery took her seat across from the CEO, the crystal water glass catching the golden ambient light. She felt entirely out of her depth, stripped of her spreadsheets and marketing projections. Victoria leaned back in her chair, observing Avery with the slow, deliberate focus of a predator admiring its prize. "You are overthinking, Avery," Victoria murmured, breaking the silence with a voice that felt like a physical touch. "I brought you here to eat, to breathe, and to forget about the Vance Global quarterly reports." Course after course of exquisite, Michelin-level cuisine was brought out by silent servers who seemed to anticipate their every need. Yet, Avery barely registered the taste of the saffron risotto or the delicate sea bass. Her entire spectrum of awareness was violently tethered to the woman sitting just a few feet away. Victoria ate with the same terrifying elegance she applied to corporate takeovers, completely unhurried and precise. Every time Avery glanced up, she found Victoria's piercing blue eyes already waiting for her, unapologetically tracking her movements. As the plates were cleared, a hushed quiet fell over the glass-enclosed room, heavy with an electric anticipation. A single server returned, placing a pristine white plate in the exact center of the table. On it sat a flawless slice of dark red velvet cake, dusted with edible gold and resting beside a small glass dome. Avery's breath caught in her throat as Victoria reached into her tailored vest pocket. The CEO withdrew the very same wooden matchbox from the office the night before. "I believe we have a ritual to finish," Victoria whispered, her gaze dropping to the pastry. She struck the match against the box, the sharp scraping sound echoing loudly in the quiet atrium. The flame flared into life, casting dancing shadows over the sharp, aristocratic lines of Victoria's face. Victoria held the burning match suspended over the center of the table, her eyes slowly rising to lock with Avery's. "Make a real wish this time," the billionaire commanded softly, the authority in her voice softening into a raw plea. Avery looked at the flame, then back into the dark, intoxicating depths of her boss's eyes. "I already have everything I need right now," Avery breathed out, the truth slipping past her defenses before she could stop it. Victoria's expression shifted, a flash of pure, undisguised hunger breaking through her usually impassive facade. She blew the match out herself, tossing the smoking wood onto a silver tray without ever breaking eye contact. "Not everything," Victoria corrected, her voice dropping to a gravelly, dangerous whisper that made Avery shiver. Victoria reached into the inner pocket of her coat, pulling out a sleek, black leather folder. She slid it across the polished mahogany table until the silver edge touched Avery's fingertips. Avery hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs as she slowly opened the heavy cover. Inside was a master contract, drafted on premium parchment paper, bearing the Vance Global official seal. It was not a promotion within the marketing department, nor was it a simple raise or corporate bonus. It was the deed and sole operating agreement for a fully funded, independent creative studio in Soho. Avery's name was printed in bold at the top, listed as the sole founder and executive director. "Victoria." Avery gasped, her professional composure finally shattering into a million pieces. "This is a $10 million investment." "It is a birthday gift," Victoria replied smoothly, picking up her wine glass with an infuriatingly calm demeanor. "You cannot simply gift an employee a subsidiary company because you heard them singing at midnight," Avery argued, her voice trembling. Victoria set the glass down, leaning forward until the space between them vanished into mere inches. "I am not gifting an employee anything," Victoria whispered, her gaze dropping to Avery's lips. "I am investing in the woman who is going to change my entire world." The sheer weight of the declaration hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, severing the final thread of their professional boundary. Avery stared at the contract, realizing that signing it meant surrendering to a current far more powerful than the corporate ladder. She looked back up, finding Victoria's hand resting palm up on the table, a silent, terrifying, and thrilling invitation. The silver pen felt heavier than a loaded weapon in Avery's trembling hand. She stared at the dotted line, knowing that a single signature would obliterate the life she had known. Victoria watched her with absolute stillness, a patient hunter allowing her prey the illusion of choice. When the ink finally bled into the parchment, the shift in the atmosphere was instantaneous and violently palpable. "It is done," Victoria murmured, her voice vibrating with a dark, triumphant satisfaction. The billionaire did not take the contract back. Instead, she reached out and closed Avery's trembling fingers over the leather folder. "You are no longer my employee, Avery." The drive away from the private club was enveloped in a silence that felt heavy with unspoken, dangerous possibilities. Avery expected the midnight black town car to head back toward the towering glass spire of Vance Global. Instead, she watched through the tinted windows as the city landscape shifted into the familiar, cramped streets of her own neighborhood. The luxurious vehicle pulled up to the curb of Avery's modest, pre-war apartment building, looking absurdly out of place. "Why are we here?" Avery asked, her pulse spiking as she clutched the leather folder to her chest. "You cannot build an empire while trapped in a cubicle, and I refuse to let you return to that desk," Victoria stated simply. The driver opened the door, and Victoria stepped out onto the uneven pavement with the grace of a conquering queen. Avery led the way up the 3 flights of narrow, scuffed wooden stairs, her mind reeling from the surrealism of the moment. She unlocked her door, pushing it open to reveal a living space that was clean, functional, and painfully small. Victoria stepped inside, her towering, immaculate presence immediately dominating the confined room. The billionaire took in the scattered marketing textbooks, the half-empty coffee mugs, and the worn velvet sofa with a slow, calculating gaze. "So this is where you hide when you are not making me richer," Victoria whispered, running a gloved hand along the edge of a bookshelf. Avery felt a sudden rush of vulnerability, as if her soul had been laid bare in the middle of her living room. "It isn't a penthouse on the Upper East Side, Victoria," Avery said defensively, dropping her keys into a small ceramic bowl. Victoria turned slowly, stripping off her leather gloves finger by agonizing finger. "It is perfectly you," Victoria corrected softly, closing the distance between them with slow, predatory steps. Avery backed up instinctively until her shoulder blades hit the cool plaster of the narrow hallway wall. There was nowhere left to retreat, no corporate hierarchy to hide behind, and no desk to act as a barrier. Victoria stepped into her space, bringing with her that intoxicating scent of black orchid and dangerous intent. The CEO raised her hands, her cool, aristocratic fingers gently tracing the collar of Avery's crisp white blouse. "You wear your stress like armor, Avery," Victoria murmured, her eyes dropping to the top button of the shirt. With agonizing slowness, Victoria unfastened the top button, her knuckles grazing the sensitive skin of Avery's throat. Avery's breath hitched loudly in the quiet apartment, her chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow bursts. "You don't need this armor anymore," Victoria whispered, her lips hovering mere inches from Avery's trembling jaw. The second button came undone, exposing the delicate hollow of Avery's collarbone to the cool air of the apartment. Victoria's thumb pressed lightly against Avery's racing pulse, feeling the frantic, fluttering rhythm of her heart. "Are you afraid of me, Avery?" Victoria asked, her voice dropping to a gravelly, hypnotic register. "I'm terrified," Avery admitted, her voice barely a whisper as she stared up into those piercing blue eyes. "Good," Victoria breathed out, her gaze dropping to Avery's lips with unmistakable, searing intent. "Fear means you finally understand exactly what is at stake here." Victoria leaned in, erasing the final fraction of space between them. Her lips brushed against Avery's in a touch that was devastatingly soft, entirely contradictory to her ruthless reputation. It was not a demanding kiss, but a slow, reverent exploration that shattered Avery's remaining defenses. Avery let out a soft, involuntary gasp, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of Victoria's tailored charcoal vest. The billionaire responded by pressing closer, her arm wrapping securely around Avery's waist to anchor her against the wall. The kiss deepened, tasting of expensive wine, dark secrets, and the overwhelming heat of sudden, unchecked desire. Avery's mind went entirely blank, her world narrowing down to the feeling of Victoria's mouth moving against hers. Every late night, every lonely birthday, and every ounce of corporate exhaustion melted away into the sheer intensity of the embrace. When Victoria finally pulled back, both of them were breathing heavily, the silence of the apartment replaced by the sound of their ragged breathing. Victoria rested her forehead against Avery's, her thumb gently swiping a smudged line of lipstick from the corner of Avery's mouth. "Tomorrow, we start building your empire," Victoria whispered fiercely into the quiet space. "But tonight, you are going to let me celebrate the fact that you belong to me." The sunlight slanting through the dusty blinds cast long, golden shadows across the hardwood floor. Victoria's eyes tracked the movement of the dust motes, treating the mundane apartment like a sacred sanctuary. She reached out, her fingers catching a loose strand of Avery's dark hair and tucking it gently behind her ear. "You have given 3 years of your life to making my visions a reality," Victoria murmured, her thumb lingering on Avery's cheekbone. "It is time someone dedicated their resources to realizing yours." Avery felt a tear prick the corner of her eye, the overwhelming weight of being truly seen finally breaking her composure. She had spent her entire adult life fighting for a seat at the table, expecting nothing but resistance and long, isolated nights. Now, the most powerful woman in the city was standing in her cramped hallway, offering her the world on a silver platter. Victoria noticed the glimmer of moisture, her expression softening into a vulnerability she had never shown in the boardroom. She cupped Avery's face with both hands, her palms warm and grounding against the sudden chill of Avery's skin. "No more lonely midnights, Avery," Victoria commanded gently, pressing a soft kiss to Avery's forehead. "No more stale macarons and stolen wishes in the dark." Avery leaned into the touch, her hands sliding up Victoria's arms to anchor herself against the CEO's solid frame. "What if I fail?" Avery whispered, voicing the deep-seated fear that had kept her chained to the corporate ladder. Victoria let out a low, musical chuckle that vibrated against Avery's chest. "I do not invest in failures, my darling," Victoria replied, the endearment slipping out with an effortless, devastating naturalness. "And I certainly do not let the woman I am obsessed with fall." The confession hung heavy in the air, a raw admission that stripped away the last remaining veneer of their professional history. Avery looked up, her dark eyes locking onto the blazing intensity of Victoria's gaze. She tightened her grip on Victoria's vest, pulling the taller woman back down into another desperate, all-consuming kiss. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back, only the explosive collision of two women who had finally found exactly what they were looking for. The world outside the apartment faded into insignificance, leaving only the heat, the pull, and the promise of a future completely rewritten. The crystal chandeliers of the Pierre Hotel ballroom cast a dazzling, fractured light over the wealthiest elite in New York City. Avery stood near the towering champagne pyramid, her heart beating a rapid, nervous rhythm against her ribs. She was wearing a breathtaking, midnight blue silk slip dress that clung perfectly to the elegant curves of her body. The dress had arrived at her apartment that very morning in a matte black box, accompanied by a handwritten note from Victoria that simply read, "Wear this, and conquer them." Tonight marked her very first public appearance as the executive director of her newly minted, $10 million creative agency. She took a slow sip of her champagne, trying to project a flawless aura of confidence despite the imposter syndrome whispering in her mind. Well, if it isn't Vance Global's runaway little worker bee, a voice dripping with unearned arrogance sneered from her left. Avery stiffened, immediately recognizing the grating tone of Richard, a senior vice president from her former marketing department. For 3 years, Richard had systematically taken credit for Avery's most brilliant campaigns while keeping her chained to her desk. He stepped into her personal space, his face flushed with expensive scotch and malicious intent. "I heard you quit in a dramatic huff last week, Avery," Richard mocked loudly, ensuring the nearby group of tech investors could hear him. "Are you here trying to pass out your little freelance business cards to people who actually matter?" Avery's grip tightened around the fragile stem of her champagne flute, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, icy anger. She opened her mouth to deliver a verbal strike that would have decimated his fragile ego, but the words never left her lips. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and the ambient noise of 500 conversations abruptly died. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as an electric, undeniable tension rippled through the crowd. Victoria Vance had arrived. The billionaire CEO was wearing a razor-sharp, custom white tuxedo with nothing beneath the lapels, the deep V-neck showcasing the pale, flawless skin of her chest. She looked simultaneously angelic and entirely lethal, a walking embodiment of untouchable power. The sea of industry titans, investors, and socialites literally parted to create a clear path for her. Victoria did not look at the cameras, nor did she acknowledge the desperate greetings of the executives trying to catch her eye. Her piercing blue gaze scanned the massive room for exactly 2 seconds before locking violently onto Avery. Avery's breath hitched as she watched the most powerful woman in the city walk straight toward her with slow, predatory intent. Richard, completely oblivious to the danger approaching him from behind, puffed out his chest and adjusted his tie. "Miss Vance, what an absolute pleasure to see you," Richard began, extending his sweaty hand with a sycophantic smile. Victoria did not even blink in his direction. She simply walked right past his outstretched hand as if he were entirely invisible. The CEO stepped flawlessly into Avery's personal space, erasing the professional distance dictated by polite society. Without a word of greeting, Victoria's hand reached out and settled firmly onto the bare, sensitive curve of Avery's lower back. The physical contact was bold, deeply intimate, and caused an audible gasp to ripple through the surrounding onlookers. "The dress is even more magnificent on you than I imagined," Victoria murmured, her low voice vibrating straight into Avery's chest. Avery felt a furious blush spread across her cheeks, the heat of Victoria's palm grounding her instantly. "You are causing a scene, Victoria," Avery whispered back, a tiny, thrilled smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I am merely admiring my investment," Victoria replied smoothly, her thumb brushing lazily against Avery's spine. Richard, turning an alarming shade of red from the public humiliation of being ignored, foolishly decided to speak again. "Ms. Vance, I was just telling Avery here how difficult the freelance market is right now," Richard stammered, trying to salvage his pride. Victoria finally stopped tracing circles on Avery's back and turned her head slightly to acknowledge the man's pathetic existence. Her blue eyes were entirely devoid of warmth, hitting Richard with the force of a sub-zero blizzard. "Richard, isn't it?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying a terrifying, silken calmness that made the nearby executives physically recoil. "I was reviewing the quarterly projections today, and it seems your department's efficiency has dropped by 40% in a single week." Richard swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat forming on his temple as the surrounding crowd watched in dead silence. "It appears you are entirely useless without my best director doing your actual job for you," Victoria stated, her words slicing through the air like a scalpel. "Furthermore, you are standing entirely too close to the founder and CEO of Vance Global's most heavily funded subsidiary." The revelation of Avery's new status sent a shockwave of frantic whispers through the ball-gown-clad crowd. And more importantly, Victoria continued, her tone dropping into a dark, territorial growl that was meant for everyone in the room to hear. Victoria's arm slid fully around Avery's waist, pulling the dark-haired woman flush against the immaculate white tuxedo. "You are standing entirely too close to my date." A dozen camera flashes erupted simultaneously, capturing the exact moment the untouchable Ice Queen of New York claimed the woman beside her. Richard looked as though he might faint, taking 3 clumsy steps backward before disappearing into the sea of shocked guests. Victoria did not spare him another glance. She simply looked down at Avery, the dangerous ice in her eyes melting into pure, liquid heat. "Let's get out of here," Victoria whispered, her lips brushing the shell of Avery's ear. "I have no desire to share you with the rest of the world tonight." The ride up to Victoria's private penthouse was a study in exquisite, suffocating tension. The glass elevator shot up the side of the towering skyscraper, leaving the chaotic glitter of Manhattan far below them. Avery stood perfectly still, her back pressed against the cool glass panel, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Victoria stood directly in front of her, the immaculate white tuxedo glowing faintly in the dim light of the ascending capsule. Neither of them spoke a single word as the floor numbers climbed rapidly toward the very top. The silence was heavy, thick with the adrenaline of the gala and the undeniable reality of what Victoria had just done. "You claimed me in front of the entire industry," Avery finally whispered, her voice trembling slightly in the enclosed space. Victoria stepped closer, crowding Avery against the glass until there was barely an inch of air between them. "I merely stated a fact, Avery," the billionaire murmured, her blue eyes dark and completely unreadable. "I warned you earlier that I had no intention of sharing you with the rest of the world tonight." The elevator chimed a soft, musical note as the doors slid silently open, revealing the sprawling expanse of Victoria's sanctuary. The penthouse was a breathtaking masterpiece of minimalist luxury, encased entirely in floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a 360-degree view of the city. There were no harsh overhead lights, only the soft, ambient glow of the skyline bleeding into the dark hardwood floors and plush velvet furniture. Avery stepped out cautiously, feeling entirely out of her depth in a space that reeked of generational wealth and absolute power. Before she could take more than 3 steps, she heard the soft, deliberate rustle of heavy fabric behind her. Victoria shrugged off the tailored white tuxedo jacket, tossing it carelessly over the back of a $1 million leather sofa. The action was startlingly casual, stripping away the untouchable CEO persona to reveal the vulnerable, fiercely devoted woman underneath. Beneath the jacket, Victoria wore a sheer white silk halter that clung dangerously to the sharp lines of her collarbones and torso. "Come here," Victoria commanded softly, her voice echoing in the vast, quiet room with a magnetic pull. Avery turned slowly, her midnight blue silk dress shimmering as she walked toward the center of the living area. Every step felt heavy, burdened by the realization that there was no turning back from this beautiful precipice. Victoria met her halfway, her hands reaching out to gently clasp Avery's waist, pulling her flush against her own body. The contrast between the cool, smooth silk of Avery's dress and the radiating heat of Victoria's skin was entirely intoxicating. "You were magnificent tonight," Victoria whispered, her thumbs tracing small, possessive circles against the curve of Avery's hips. "I didn't even do anything," Avery argued weakly, her hands coming up to rest tentatively on Victoria's bare shoulders. "You existed," Victoria countered flawlessly, leaning down until her lips brushed the sensitive skin just beneath Avery's ear. "And you looked at me with those dark, impossible eyes while half the room desperately tried to figure out how to destroy you." Avery shivered, the deep vibration of Victoria's voice sending a violent cascade of electricity straight down her spine. "They are going to talk about us tomorrow," Avery pointed out, desperately trying to hold onto a shred of corporate logic. Let them talk, Victoria breathed out, pressing a soft, open-mouthed kiss to the erratic pulse jumping in Avery's neck. By tomorrow afternoon, your studio will have 3 new major contracts, and Richard will be boxing up his desk. Avery gasped softly as Victoria's teeth grazed her collarbone, a sharp, sudden bite of pleasure that erased every thought of office politics. Victoria's hands slid slowly up Avery's back, her long fingers finding the delicate silver zipper of the midnight blue gown. "May I?" Victoria asked, her voice dropping an octave, heavy with a raw hunger she was no longer trying to mask. Avery could only nod, her vocal cords entirely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming intensity of the billionaire's gaze. The sound of the zipper sliding down was deafening in the quiet penthouse, a slow, deliberate countdown to complete surrender. The heavy silk pulled around Avery's ankles, leaving her standing in the moonlight, completely exposed and entirely worshipped. Victoria took a slow step back, her eyes raking over Avery's form with a reverence that felt almost religious. "You are so utterly beautiful, Avery," Victoria murmured, her voice stripped of all its usual icy control. She reached out, her knuckles gently trailing down the center of Avery's chest, making the younger woman shudder violently. Avery reached out, grabbing the edges of Victoria's silk halter, pulling the taller woman back down into a desperate, bruising kiss. There was no hesitation left, no lingering doubts about professional boundaries or societal expectations. They collided with the force of 2 stars collapsing into each other, a chaotic tangle of breathless gasps and fierce demands. Victoria backed Avery up toward the massive glass window, pressing her gently against the cool pane as the city of New York glittered silently below them. The physical dominance was absolute, yet every touch, every kiss, was laced with an agonizing, tender desperation to protect. Avery wrapped her arms tightly around Victoria's neck, anchoring herself in the storm as the billionaire's hands mapped every inch of her skin. In the shadow of the Manhattan skyline, the ruthless CEO finally surrendered her entire empire to the only woman who had ever dared to claim her heart. The scent of dark, artisanal espresso and fresh linen was the first thing that drifted into Avery's consciousness. She opened her eyes slowly, finding herself wrapped in premium cotton sheets that felt incredibly soft against her bare skin. The harsh, blinding glare of the Manhattan sun was blocked by the penthouse's automated sheer curtains, filtering the room in a warm, amber glow. Avery turned her head slightly, her gaze landing on the empty space beside her where the sheets were still slightly rumpled. A sudden, deep wave of memory washed over her, the late-night gala, the public declaration, and the intense, unhurried surrender in the dark. She sat up, pulling the heavy duvet up to her collarbone, her eyes tracking a trail of discarded clothes on the hardwood floor. Before she could step out of bed, a soft, familiar sound of porcelain clicking against marble echoed from the adjacent kitchen. Avery slid into Victoria's oversized white silk button-down shirt that had been left draped over a nearby chair. The fabric hung loosely on her frame, the hem hitting the middle of her thighs and smelling vividly of Victoria's signature black orchid perfume. She walked out into the vast, open-concept living area, her bare feet making absolutely no sound on the polished floors. Victoria Vance was standing by the Italian marble kitchen island, a silver espresso machine steaming softly beside her. The billionaire had completely abandoned her ruthless corporate armor, wearing only a pair of soft gray lounge pants and a loose silk tank top. Her blonde hair was unstyled, tumbling over her shoulders in messy, beautiful waves that Avery had never seen in a boardroom. As if sensing Avery's presence, Victoria turned around, a slow, incredibly tender smile breaking across her usually cold features. "You're awake," Victoria murmured, her voice carrying a low, gravelly morning rasp that sent an immediate shiver down Avery's spine. She picked up 2 crystal mugs of coffee and walked toward Avery with unhurried, measured steps. "I tried to be quiet, but I suppose the machine is a bit too loud for a light sleeper, the older woman added. Victoria set the mugs down on a side table and immediately stepped into Avery's personal space, closing the distance between them entirely. Her long, elegant fingers reached out, gently grabbing the collar of the oversized shirt Avery was wearing. "This looks infinitely better on you than it ever did on me," Victoria whispered, her blue eyes darkening with immediate appreciation. She leaned down, her lips brushing against Avery's cheek before settling onto her mouth in a slow, deep, and comforting morning kiss. The kiss tasted faintly of sweet vanilla and rich espresso, completely devoid of the frantic desperation from the night before. Avery wrapped her arms around Victoria's neck, leaning her weight against the older woman's solid, reassuring frame. "We have to go to work eventually, Victoria," Avery breathed out against her lips, though she made no effort to actually pull away. "You don't have a boss anymore, Avery," Victoria reminded her softly, her thumb tracing the line of Avery's jaw. "You dictate your own time." "But my new team is expecting me at the Soho studio at 2 o'clock, Avery replied, a small, ambitious smile tugging at her lips. Victoria's eyes flared with a fierce, quiet pride at the mention of the independent studio. "Then we shall ensure your arrival is absolutely unforgettable," the billionaire promised, kissing the tip of Avery's nose before releasing her. By 1:45 p.m., the midnight black town car was navigating the trendy, cobblestone streets of Lower Manhattan. Avery was dressed in a sharp, tailored cream blazer and matching trousers, looking every bit the executive director she now was. Beside her, Victoria was back in her element, wearing a structured navy vest and looking sharp enough to cut glass. The car pulled up to a beautiful, historic cast-iron building with massive arched windows overlooking a bustling Soho corner. A sleek, brushed bronze plaque beside the double glass doors read simply, "Avery Creative International." Avery's hands grew cold with a sudden surge of adrenaline as she stared at her own name etched into the metal. Victoria reached across the leather seat, her warm hand covering Avery's freezing fingers and squeezing them firmly. "This is your empire, Avery," Victoria whispered, her voice rich with an unshakable conviction. "Go claim it." They stepped out of the vehicle together, walking up the short flight of stone steps and pushing through the heavy glass doors. The interior was a spectacular blend of industrial charm and modern luxury, featuring exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and state-of-the-art workstations. As Avery crossed the threshold, a sudden eruption of loud applause and cheers shattered the quiet atmosphere of the studio. 20 of the industry's most talented young designers, copywriters, and strategists were standing in a semicircle, smiling warmly at her. Victoria had not just bought a building, she had headhunted the absolute best creative minds in the city to work under Avery's leadership. "Welcome to your kingdom, boss," a senior designer said, stepping forward to hand Avery a sleek digital tablet. Avery looked down at the screen, her dark eyes widening in absolute shock as she read the live dashboard. The very first active project loaded into the studio's pipeline was not a minor startup or a local boutique brand. It was the master creative contract for Vance Global's upcoming global tech hardware launch, a historic, multi-million-dollar account. Avery turned around rapidly, her eyes finding Victoria standing near the back of the room, her arms crossed over her chest. The billionaire CEO gave her a subtle, incredibly arrogant nod, a dangerous smirk playing on her perfect lips. "A good investor always secures their anchor client on day one," Victoria noted smoothly, her voice carrying across the quiet room. Avery walked straight back to her, completely ignoring the eyes of her new staff as she stopped inches from Victoria. "You are completely insane," Avery whispered, her heart swelling with an overwhelming combination of love and ambition. "I am merely a woman who recognizes genius, Avery," Victoria murmured, her voice dropping to a private, seductive register. She reached out, her fingers brushing the lapel of Avery's cream blazer, a public gesture that left no doubt about their connection. Now, go show my board of directors exactly why I spent $10 million to set you free. The massive mahogany doors of the Vance Global Executive Boardroom felt entirely different from the outside. For 3 long years, Avery had only entered this room as a silent ghost, carrying stacks of files for other people. Today, she pushed the heavy doors open as the founder and lead visionary of Avery Creative International. She was wearing a tailored, crimson-red power suit that demanded absolute attention the moment she crossed the threshold. A dozen skeptical board members turned their heads, their faces etched with the conservative doubt of old money. They were waiting to see if Victoria's $10 million investment was a brilliant strategy or a foolish mistake. Avery walked to the head of the long table, the sharp click of her heels echoing with absolute, unwavering authority. She did not look for permission, nor did she wait for an introduction. She simply connected her sleek digital tablet to the main projector and illuminated the room with her vision. At the very center of the table sat Victoria Vance, exuding a terrifying, untouchable aura of corporate dominance. The billionaire wore a structured charcoal blazer, her hands steepled beneath her chin, her face an impenetrable fortress of ice. She looked exactly like the ruthless tech titan the world feared. But beneath the heavy mahogany table, the reality between them was entirely different. As Avery began to speak, her voice steady and commanding, a soft, deliberate pressure brushed against her left leg. Victoria had silently slipped her foot out of her designer stiletto. The tip of Victoria's silk-clad foot reached out in the shadows, hooking gently around the back of Avery's ankle. Avery's breath hitched for a fraction of a second, but she seamlessly covered it by switching to the next slide. She projected the new global marketing metrics, delivering a flawless, data-driven strategy that left the room in stunned silence. Every time Avery made a devastatingly brilliant point, Victoria's foot would trace a slow, agonizingly slow circle against her calf. It was a maddening, intoxicating game of absolute contrast. Above the table, Avery was commanding a multi-billion-dollar room. Below it, she was completely at the mercy of the woman she loved. The projected ROI on this campaign exceeds our quarterly targets by 42%, Avery concluded, her dark eyes flashing with triumph. She looked directly down the length of the table, meeting Victoria's intense, piercing blue gaze without flinching. A low murmur of genuine approval rippled through the old executives, their previous skepticism entirely obliterated by her genius. Victoria lowered her hands, resting them flat on the polished wood. "The proposal is approved," Victoria stated, her voice carrying that final, unquestionable authority. "Ms. Avery, I would like to discuss the rollout schedule with you immediately in my private lounge." The board members immediately began packing their briefcases, eager to vacate the room before the CEO's legendary impatience flared. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy boardroom doors clicked shut, leaving Avery alone in the adjacent executive lounge. She barely had time to set her tablet down on the glass table before the air in the room shifted violently. Victoria stepped into the space and locked the door with a sharp, definitive click. All the icy composure of the boardroom vanished in a single heartbeat, replaced by a raw, burning pride. Victoria crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing the lapels of Avery's crimson suit and pulling her flush against the wall. "You were completely spectacular," Victoria breathed out, her voice vibrating with a dark, overwhelming adoration. Avery let out a breathless laugh, her hands coming up to wrap securely around Victoria's narrow waist. "You were distracting me on purpose during the most important presentation of my life," Avery accused softly. "I simply needed to remind you who you belong to," Victoria countered smoothly, her eyes dropping to Avery's lips. The CEO leaned down, capturing Avery's mouth in a fierce, demanding kiss that tasted of victory and unfiltered desire. Avery kissed her back with equal ferocity, entirely unafraid to meet the billionaire's overwhelming energy. She was no longer the exhausted, lonely girl blowing out a match in the dark. She was an equal, a queen standing right beside the emperor in a kingdom they were building together. Victoria finally pulled back, resting her forehead against Avery's, her chest heaving slightly. "You took my breath away in that room, Avery," Victoria whispered, her thumb gently tracing the flush on Avery's cheek. "I didn't just invest in a creative studio, I invested in a revolution." Avery smiled, resting her hands flat against the immaculate charcoal fabric of Victoria's blazer. "This is only the beginning, Victoria," Avery murmured, leaning up to press a soft kiss to the corner of the CEO's jaw. "I promise you, I am going to make Vance Global the most feared name on the planet." Victoria's eyes flared with an intense, magnificent heat, her hands tightening possessively around Avery's waist. "You already have, my darling," Victoria replied, the world outside the locked door fading into complete insignificance. The glow of the New York skyline had never looked more magnificent than it did exactly 1 year later. Avery stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of their shared penthouse, a glass of vintage champagne resting lightly in her hand. She was wearing a sleek, ivory silk robe that Victoria had specifically tailored for her, a far cry from her old, rigid corporate armor. Her independent creative studio had just closed its most profitable quarter in history, making Avery one of the most powerful young executives in the city. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about boardrooms, revenue streams, or marketing campaigns. The small digital clock on the grand mantel flickered silently, shifting its numbers to 11:59 p.m. on October 13th. A soft, familiar rustle of heavy fabric sounded from the grand hallway, sending a preemptive shiver down Avery's spine. Victoria walked into the ambient light, carrying a beautifully crafted, silver-tiered tray. She wasn't wearing a sharply pressed suit or a terrifying boardroom scowl today. Instead, the billionaire was dressed in soft, dark cashmere, looking impossibly warm and devastatingly beautiful. Resting on the silver tray was a massive, flawless red velvet cake, adorned with delicate, edible gold leaf. In the exact center of the cake sat a single, elegant white candle, completely unlit. "I believe it is almost midnight, my love," Victoria murmured, setting the tray down on the polished marble coffee table. Avery smiled, turning away from the glittering skyline to look at the woman who had completely rewritten her universe. "You didn't have to do all this, Victoria," Avery whispered, walking over to wrap her arms loosely around the older woman's waist. Victoria let out a low, musical chuckle, her hands coming up to cup Avery's face with absolute, reverent devotion. "Last year, I watched the most brilliant woman in the world celebrate her existence with a crushed macaron and a wooden match," Victoria replied softly. "I made a silent vow to myself that night that you would never experience another second of that profound loneliness." The antique clock on the mantel chimed a soft, melodious note, signaling the official arrival of midnight. October 14th had officially begun. Victoria reached into her pocket and pulled out the very same wooden matchbox she had kept since that fateful night in the office. She struck the match, the bright flare illuminating the deep, oceanic blue of her eyes as she held it to the candle. The soft golden light cast long, dancing shadows across the quiet sanctuary of their penthouse. "Make your wish, Avery," Victoria commanded gently, her voice dropping to that gravelly, intoxicating register. Avery looked at the flame, her heart swelling with an emotion so vast and powerful it threatened to consume her. She didn't need to close her eyes or think about what was missing in her life. Everything she could ever dream of was standing right in front of her, looking at her as if she hung the stars in the sky. Avery leaned forward and blew out the candle, plunging the room back into the soft, romantic glow of the city lights. When the thin wisp of smoke cleared, Avery expected Victoria to pull her into a desperate, celebratory kiss. Instead, she found the untouchable CEO of Vance Global slowly descending onto one knee. Avery gasped aloud, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in absolute shock. Victoria looked up at her, her eyes completely devoid of their usual icy calculation, replaced by raw, overwhelming vulnerability. From her pocket, Victoria produced a small, velvet box and clicked it open, revealing a breathtaking, flawless diamond ring. The diamond caught the ambient light of the city, throwing fractured rainbows across the dark walls of the living room. It was a custom piece, specifically designed to match the fierce, undeniable brilliance of the woman it was meant for. Victoria's hands were remarkably steady as she held the box, but her eyes betrayed the terrifying hope anchoring her soul. "A year ago, I invested $10 million to set you free," Victoria said, her voice steady but laced with deep emotion. "But tonight, I am asking you to let me invest my entire life, my heart, and my soul into ours." Avery felt the hot tears spill over her eyelashes, the sheer magnitude of the moment shattering her remaining composure. "Will you marry me, Avery?" Victoria asked, laying her entire empire at the feet of the woman she loved. "Yes," Avery sobbed, falling to her knees to crash into Victoria's arms. "Yes, Victoria, yes." They held each other tightly on the floor of the penthouse, surrounded by the remnants of a beautiful cake and a burnt-out match. Victoria slipped the cold metal of the ring onto Avery's trembling finger, a permanent, unbreakable vow bound in platinum. The fit was absolutely perfect, a seamless addition to a hand that had spent years clawing its way up the corporate ladder alone. Victoria pulled back just enough to capture Avery's lips in a kiss that tasted of salt, sweet champagne, and absolute surrender. It wasn't a kiss of dominance or control, it was a desperate, tender promise to protect her forever. The world outside the glass continued its chaotic, relentless spin, but inside this room, time had stopped completely. Avery rested her forehead against Victoria's, her thumb gently tracing the sharp line of the billionaire's jaw. "You are the only wish I have ever made that actually came true," Avery whispered fiercely against Victoria's neck. "Happy birthday to me," Avery breathed out, the ironic, heartbreaking lyrics of the past transformed into a statement of pure, triumphant joy. Victoria smiled, a genuine, blinding expression that could bring the entire financial district to its knees. "Happy birthday, my brilliant wife," Victoria replied, sealing the promise with one final, devastatingly sweet kiss. There were no more lonely midnights, no more stolen wishes, and no more hiding in the shadows of the corporate world. Avery finally knew exactly what it felt like to be completely, unreservedly, and absolutely loved.